from Alinea Consulting in London, and he's going to introduce our panelists and get things going. Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on your location. As Steve said, this is the first of our series of digital events around the topic of humanizing high density, which is the theme of our conference this year. This particular discussion, adapting urban density in the age of pandemics, is obviously very topical. And you've probably seen or heard of a few webinars on the subject of COVID, but I think you'll find this one a little different, not least because of our intriguing array of speakers, which includes an industrial hygienist, a clinical planner, a professor of places and planning, and an architect. And I'm sure when lockdown is finished, if all of those people walked into a bar, we could make a very intellectual joke about it. But before we hear from them, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I think we got our maximum of 500 people registered, and thank you all for your donations, which are going to be passed to the World Health Organization's COVID Solidarity Response Fund. I think we're close to something like $3,000 for that organization, $2,000 of which, by the way, came from one individual. So whoever you are out there, we're very grateful. I'd also like to thank not only Steve Henry for his immense organizational skills, but also Sean Mills over in Singapore, who's actually head of high rise for Ramboll and a CTBUH trustee. And both Steve and Sean will be collating questions that you either send or raise your virtual hand for. So, okay, let's get started. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce Suzanne MacCormick. Suzanne is the Global Healthcare Business Growth Director at WSP. She's a clinical planner by background and has been advising clients on how to adapt urban environments from malls to international airports to meet the challenges of pandemics. So very, very topical. She's actually dedicated her career to the pursuit of clinical excellence and how we can achieve greater health and well-being. She still actually has a clinical practice and works with patients to achieve life-changing behavioral and emotional change, and is particularly interested in the power of the subconscious mind on overall mental health. And importantly for this discussion, how our built environment impacts all of that. Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Steve. Let's just take control of the screen. Just a tiny bit of scene setting then. Currently, about half of our world's population lives in cities, and it's estimated that that is growing by 2 people every second, which means by 2050, about 70% of our population will live in cities. And across the world, there are many commonalities in cities, and there are positives and negatives. So the positives of the city living with wild social tapestry of great entertainment and tourism, amazing cuisine. But the negatives include the meeting of the 2 most pressing problems that we probably face as a world, which is poverty and environmental degradation. So as a clinical planner, I just want to focus for a few moments on the health impacts of the urban environment and consider our responsibilities as planners and designers and engineers in developing cities that are sustainable and healthy for all of us. So let's look at the component parts that impact and are impacted by our cities. So in the first instance, we have climate change that we're all aware of, that impacts the city itself. We've had an incredible amount of extreme weather events, even over the last year, increasing floods and droughts and storms, which in themselves increase the spread of diseases. And they have costly impacts on our city's services, infrastructures, housing, and all of that, of course, impacts our livelihoods and our health. But at the same time, cities contribute enormously to climate change itself. And in fact, they're responsible for 75% of global CO2 emissions, largely from transport and buildings. Already up on the screen, you can see the noise icon. And that's because cities, as cities grow, the impact of noise is increasing, and it's impacting massively on people's health. So it's not only an irritant, there have been studies that show it increases blood pressure, heart attacks, and type 2 diabetes. And they're just some of the illnesses that we've discovered are impacted by the noise. But also, noise pollution, interestingly, tracks social segregation. It's much worse in areas of poverty. If we look very quickly then at housing, we all know that housing the impact of good housing is clear. And poor housing with pests and water leaks, poor ventilation, has an impact on how well people are. Nutrition. Nutrition is a key thing, and for many countries, the current rate of expansion of urban agglomerations has brought severe challenges to food and nutrition security, which of course is the basis of human life. We all know that green spaces have an impact on our well-being and how we feel, but more than that, they actually have an impact on combating the impact of air population. So they're really, really important for our cities. And then there's water. So cities themselves rely very heavily on clean running water. And what's shocking is that 1 in 4 cities across the world, 1 in 4 residents in cities across the world live without access to sanitation facilities. And 27% in the developing world don't have access to clean running water at home. We then have air, and I think over the last few weeks we've all become more and more aware of how important our air is to us. But air pollution was killing people long before this COVID-19 pandemic struck us. And it's been linked to increases in rates of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and a wide range of respiratory diseases. And some research in America has shown that about 40% of people will die through air pollution. And then that goes full circle back to climate change, because there is an impact of air on climate change. Let's look then at one of the things I'm really interested in, which is the cognitive overload of cities. I'm interested in how humans respond to our environment. And it's been proven that people who live in cities experience more psychological stress than people who live in rural areas. And we actually can see in our studies the increased impact in the amygdala of the brain, which is the fear center of the brain, in people that live in cities. So we have to look at how we can combat the increased cognitive overload from the crowds and the architecture and the noise, and design spaces that nurture and care for those with mental health illness, but also those of us that don't have mental health illness, to enable us to thrive and look from the macro picture and the wider functioning of a city to the microcosms that make up the bigger picture. So noise we've talked about and the impact of that. But also, how about intuitive wayfinding that precludes sensory overload, and biophilic design and the connection to green space that we know makes us feel better, and the creation of appropriate rest spaces that provides peace and breaks from our city pressures, and creation of logical design that reduces cognitive load on individuals, and clean air. But also the power of the subconscious mind and its response to certain triggers and colours and images, and how that impacts our well-being, and how we can interweave that in our city design to make cities a healthier and more sustainable place to live. So then finally, the impact of COVID. We've learned, all of us over the last couple of weeks, new terms like social distancing and the new normal. But what does that mean as we now try to go back to work? So what does that new normal look like? Are we going to be happy for agile working where we're sharing desks with other people? What about those high traffic touch points like handles and lift buttons and handrails and moving stair rails? What about those? And the crowds that we all know and love in the hubbub of the city, and our green spaces that in cities look more like that. How do we manage those to make sure that our cities are not just exciting places to live, but fit and healthy places to live? So what do we need to do to ensure that our cities are safe? And how do we ensure that they're healthy and sustainable places? There's a need for integration with healthcare, well-being and policymakers so that we can reshape the approach to city design from the inside out. From buildings to street design and transport hubs to safe spaces that achieve the most benefit for us all. It's a big challenge, but that's the one we face now. Steve, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. An alarming reminder of the negative impacts that cities can have on all of us, and I'm sure we can have a discussion about that very shortly. Next up, it's the turn of Rottersman, and special thanks to Rob, who is 6 hours behind us in Chicago, so I'm not sure how much sleep he had last night. Rob has over 20 years of experience in industrial hygiene and epidemiology, with a focus on the evaluation and analysis of chemical and microbial exposures. He's an expert in matters related to Legionella and mold in buildings across hospitals, hotels, and commercial properties. Currently part of an American Industrial Hygiene Association team working to develop state of science guidance for COVID response. And Rob's actually co-authored publications related to cleaning and reoccupancy of buildings. He's also a member of Ramboll's coronavirus expertise team and has been working with clients to minimize risk in their facilities. And actually, prior to consulting, Rob was served as a US Peace Corps volunteer where he worked in disease surveillance. So again, very topical to this subject. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit about the virus, how it's transmitted, and in ways we can potentially try to minimize risk or control it. Often when we're talking about urban environments and sources of pollution, shall we say, as Suzanne alluded to earlier, we're often talking about point sources, things we know and things we can fairly easily control, whether it be combustion in buildings, your boilers, your mechanical systems, where you can take the combustion exhaust, capture it, and exhaust it. It's fairly straightforward. When we're talking about disease, our source is our people. It's the occupants of our building, which is a much more challenging source to try to control. We have to be a little bit more creative. We need to understand how the virus is transmitted from person to person. I think there's a misconception right now that really relates to buildings about air transmission. Yes, the virus is transmitted via air, but it needs to be encapsulated within a droplet. So it makes it not just, but it is actually a droplet size particle that causes infection. This is outside of healthcare. And if you have a healthcare facility, you do have procedures that could aerosolize a smaller virus. But in most buildings, it's not going to travel very far. It's not going to get into your ventilation system and be dispersed, which is very, very important. If we're talking about high-rise buildings, if this virus was able to be transmitted outside of a droplet, then it could get in your ventilation system and spread from floor to floor. We're not seeing that yet. And my guess is with a couple months into this, if that were the case, we would know about it. So we're fortunate in that realm. So our transmission from person to person is through close contact, 1, maybe 2 meters away. It's also through surfaces. We now over time have learned that this virus can live on surfaces, in some cases for a few hours, in some cases for a few days. So we have transmission from person to person via airborne droplets, and we have transmission via touching surfaces. One of the more challenging things we're dealing with when we're dealing with the human factor of transmission of viruses is we've come to learn more and more, and it's extremely important to understand that a lot of our cases and carriers of this virus are either asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. In other words, they're walking down the streets, they're walking into buildings, and they have no idea that they have the virus. We had temperature screenings early on, and we're still doing that. But the majority of people who have a temperature are not feeling well enough to get out of their house. There's a lot of people walking around carrying the virus that never have a temperature, or they haven't had a temperature yet, but they can still shed the virus. They may have one a few days on. So that becomes challenging because we have a source within the population that does not know they're infected. And I think that's one of the main reasons we're seeing such a widespread pandemic, because often with other diseases, if people know they're sick, they stay home. So if we go to the next slide, we talked about virus transmission. We know it's here. We know how it's transmitted. How are we going to control it? How are we going to manage it within our buildings? Again, we look at what we call a hierarchy of control. So when we try and figure out how are we to control a contaminant, any type of pollution or exposure, whether it be chemical or biological, the hierarchy of control is number 1, you eliminate. Number 2, administrative controls. And number 3, personal protective equipment. So our best control is to eliminate. And we're not going to eliminate people from urban environments. As Suzanne said, we're moving in a culture where a lot more people are living in cities. What we can try to eliminate are people that carry the virus coming into the buildings, which again is a challenge when you're doing temperature screening, but we're seeing advancements in more rapid testing. So it is possible now to potentially screen people for the virus before entering buildings in some areas. There's also other technology out there measuring oxygen levels in blood and other things where we can try and eliminate the people that are carrying the virus from the building. Next, we go into administrative controls. I think this is probably one of the more common approaches, which is social distancing. It's keeping people separate. It's maybe looking at that conference room in your building that is fairly condensed area with a lot of people, taking some chairs out of there, not encouraging groups to congregate very closely together, increasing the ventilation rates potentially. If you have these smaller conference rooms, when you're designing the buildings, dump in a lot more outdoor air and try and dilute any airborne droplets. Then we get into engineering controls. With engineering controls, we might look at, again, ventilation as a form of engineering controls, bringing in more outdoor air. We might try to also eliminate surfaces, get rid of those frequently touched surfaces. If you have an elevator that has buttons, and people are constantly hitting those buttons, can those be controlled by an app, an application? Maybe your doors become automatic. Maybe your light switches, you go completely away from touch light switches. And putting in controls like that. And lastly, personal protective equipment. We want to try and stop the virus before it gets into somebody's breathing zone, but the personal protective equipment and masks are important. It's the third and last line of defense to stop the virus once it's in somebody's breathing zone. So that's our last step in the hierarchy of controls, but it's also very important. Unfortunately, there's a shortage of masks right now that actually do provide a proper seal around the face to provide perfect protection. But what's out there and what people are wearing are absolutely better than nothing. So that's my little introduction, and I look forward to your questions and hopefully providing you some valuable information today.
Thank you very much, Rob. Very thought-provoking taster of the challenges we will face when we return to our workplaces or if we do live in our cities. Next, it's an absolute pleasure to have Peter Rees on board. I know Peter very well. He spent 29 years as the City of London Corporation's Chief Planning Officer and was described by the Financial Times as the man who shaped the face of the City of London more than any other person over 3 decades. And Peter actually lives in one of the high-rise creations that he approved, and you'll probably see when he appears on screen his lovely background from his apartment. On the 27th floor of the Heron building, a rare residential building in the City of London, and probably the first major residential development, I think, since the Barbican Centre. Peter is now Professor of Places and City Planning at the Bartlett School of Planning at University College London, where I'm sure he teaches and entertains in equal measure. Peter.
Thank you, Steve. In the City of London, we're no stranger to the effects of plague. We have a 2,000-year history of trading, and over 600 years ago, we imported a plague from China called the Black Death, which killed half of the population. The city adapted. It came back even stronger, having started the wool trade from this country, and that introduced manufacturing into Britain, and London benefited enormously from that. These plagues bounced around again, and I suppose the most famous great one was 1666, following the 1665, I should say, the Black Death, as it was called at the time. Great Plague was the other name. And this again reduced the population tremendously and was compounded by 80% of the city burning down in 1666, the following year. But the city bounced back again. This time it introduced merchant banking and financial dealing. And indeed it has carried on with the strength of that industry ever since. In the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, again, there were plagues. And out of these plagues, London took the opportunity to start creating social housing and creating better conditions for public health. So again, something good came out of that. So I'm very confident that our great cities, and my own in particular, will survive the current pandemic and will come back better and stronger than before. But the most important thing, as you will have seen from all of these previous plagues we have faced, is that you shouldn't try to come back as the same as you were before. You need to learn things and adapt to create a new normal. The city has already been doing a lot of that prior to the pandemic. The giant corporations are becoming much less influential. The banks are reducing their impact on the economy. We've seen oil companies losing their strength as oil becomes less integral to our future. And now, of course, we're seeing airlines shrinking to a relatively small part of what they were previously. This is all very positive. This all indicates that the new strength isn't in giant corporations or in giant buildings, but is in the small startup business, or even, as we see in this picture, the pop-up office. An office with a roof, 2 walls, a table and chairs in the outdoors. Much safer than being trapped in an air-conditioned building with who knows what virus kicking around. This is an example of the sort of change that occupiers of office space are making in the city at the moment. Not only restoring and regenerating existing buildings, some of them very old buildings, building some new buildings, but above all, creating really good spaces, because good places need good spaces. And within those spaces, then having pop-up activities like the pop-up office I've shown here. But this might also be artwork. It might be things that just surprise and intrigue people, things that encourage people to spend as much as possible of the working day outside, not inside their office building. They prefer to do that anyway because the boss can't hear what they're saying and the government can't spy on them. So that's a very good way for people to come up with ingenious new ideas out of the surveillance society. If we are making this better place, and if many cities around the world are innovating, what is the real problem from the pandemic? Well, I say it's not places, it's not density of occupation, it's density of travel. We are all traveling far too much. And however the virus and wherever the virus started, we do know how it was spread. Tens of millions of Chinese people moved from between one Chinese city and another during a holiday period and spread the virus through China. Young people went to the Alps in Europe for their skiing holidays, brought home a virus, and their grandparents died. Elderly people with more money went off on cruises. They spread and interchanged the viruses, and at the end came back and infected their neighbors. So the vector is the unnecessary travel. We need to find ways of reducing the amount of travel by increasing the cost of air travel, by outlawing cruises. We already know some cities like Venice are fed up with the cultural destruction that is caused by cruises, where vast numbers of people descend on very precious environments and reduce them to the level they have brought with them, rather than enjoying their individual charm. So the cruise industry was due for the chop anyway. Airlines are now joining them, and we're already seeing this across Europe as the airlines make announcements for their downsizing. But we need to repurpose our travel. We need to use the cruise ships to create universities and hospitals in developing countries, anchor them in harbors and put them to good use. And in the next slide, you'll see that in the City of London, we're also repurposing transport. If we can have the next slide, please, where one of the London taxi cabs has already been repurposed as a place where you can sit and enjoy the flowers. It's a place of rest. It's a place for people to gossip, a place for people to come together rather than to travel needlessly. Let's improve transport within places, and let's make it more difficult to travel between places. Let's slow down the high-speed trains, make them less frequent. That way, each city will develop its own facilities and protect its own facilities, and they won't be extracted by more powerful cities to which you are connected by high-speed communications. So let's remember one thing above all. It's not architects and engineers and developers that make places. It's people that make places, and hopefully they should be making places rather than travel. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Peter. A positive call for change there. And as you suggest, no longer the power will be with giant corporations, no longer will the future be in large air-conditioned offices, and we will travel a lot less, perhaps. Some very, very thought-provoking stuff that I know we will talk about further and discuss in a second. Okay, lastly and certainly not least, and for those of you in Asia, you will know him well, Wong. Wynne is the founding director of Singapore-based WOHA, very renowned architectural practice that has quite an amazing portfolio of buildings across Asia and Australia, and perhaps elsewhere that I don't know about, from residential towers to mass transit stations and various other typologies too. Wynne is a particular advocate of design responses to climate change and to the challenges of urbanisation. His practice is multi-award winning, and I know because his Oasia Hotel downtown in Singapore was voted best tall building in the world in 2018 by the CTBUH. A very colourful and striking town incorporating 60 stories of vegetation as well as generous volumes of communal space. And if you want an example of a truly socially sustainable project, I would recommend you take a look at WOHA's Kampung Admiralty building in Singapore, another CTBUH award winner, and I think also the World Architecture Festival's World Building of the Year. Wynne.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. It's been a surreal couple of weeks, and I do hope that life is not going to be the same anymore, but I think I do worry that we are not going to learn the lessons of this pandemic. So I think the pertinent question is for this discussion is urban density the problem? Or is it really cities and developments are not built without sufficient spaces, social spaces, amenities, or incorporating enough nature or safeguarding enough nature and allowing corporations to maximize profits? I think this is something that we kind of need to discuss as we think how to build our cities. But while we're still in this lockdown, it's easy to panic and overreact, and that the reaction is always going to be weighted to one side. But I do like to see the goodness of this whole pandemic, and maybe we could have the next slide, Stephen. I think this is images that was taken out from social media, and what is quite amazing is the before the pandemic and during the lockdown, almost practically every cities in the world that is actually having pollution is just completely having clear blue skies and clear days, hardly any noise pollution, and people are enjoying fresh air all over again. And I think there's something we kind of do need to enjoy and to realize that our skies are blue and clear before, but they're not now. And according to the World Health Organization, almost 4.6 million people die each year caused directly by air pollution. So that's a huge population that we are not panicking about or even talking and trying to do more about. And I think this is something that we do need to put in perspective, that our world is different. We do need to see the bigger picture, and that I think climate change is a major problem. Stephen, the next slide. This is an interesting one because when the first slide was in Singapore, and we actually have otters coming and roaming the streets to find new habitats. Singapore has actually enclosed all its waterways to turn it into reservoirs for drinking water. And we do have very good catchment areas for these otters, but because there are no other animals sitting on top of them in the hierarchy, they have been becoming more overpopulated, and that the younger members of them are actually searching out other water bodies to try to make homes. And so they were seen all over the city when there were no cars, trying to stretch their habitats. And I think that is a very good sign that, that basically man has actually taken up too much of the wildlife habitat, and that we do really need to see how we can actually reverse this to repair and even to regenerate our planet. And I think all over the world, we are seeing all this scenes of animals coming back to take back some of the spaces. And I think this is very, very interesting and also amusing. But I think, but what is also interesting is that all the spaces that the animals are roaming are empty roads and empty highways. And I think everywhere in the world now, in cities, people are beginning to realize, and we can actually see the effects of not having cars on the streets. We have clearer skies, less pollution, less noise and air pollution. I think it's quite amazing. And certainly I think it's healthier as you open the windows and you can actually breathe fresh air. This is something I think we do need to realize, that our lives could be a lot better without vehicles, and that we really should think of more public transportations and to optimize the use of last mile mobility rather than actually relying on cars. And I think it's also interesting to note that at least 1.35 million people die in road crashes every year. So I think these are, again, alarming numbers that we don't panic and overreact about, but we should be. And I think we should talk in terms of how we could actually make a better world. Stephen, the last slide. I think we have been advocates of a better world, how we should actually address climate change, and also how to repair, regenerate, and be resilient to even repair our planet. And I think we can actually do them through three key themes that I hope we can actually discuss a little bit more, if not in Singapore during the CTBUH conference. It's about how we need to move away from two-dimensional city planning ideas and move towards a three-dimensional integrated city planning, where people don't need to travel as much to go to work or to any place, that they can actually move in a very short distances within where they actually live and work. And I think that's something that has to do with the way cities has been overzoned and depending a lot on mono users. I think we do need to think about how we actually rethink our city plannings and our developments. And the other big topic that I think is important to actually consider is that we must still maintain high density and not use every single square kilometers of the planet. But at the same time, we can also equally provide high density to our high amenity to our high density. And the last topic I think that is not thought about sufficiently is system thinking, and how we actually think about systems, and particularly systems that actually help repair a planet. How we can actually consider buildings to actually do more than just providing functional users, but actually do things like being able to generate clean energy, produce food, clean air and water. And I think these are systems that we need to put together with our developments and buildings and come up with a new kind of direction to take in the post-pandemic times. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Wynne. That point about 3D city planning and the creation of high density spaces with high amenity, I'd like to come to in a sec. But the first thing you said was, I do hope that life is not going to be the same again, which is a positive thought about the future, but also perhaps a recognition that things at the moment aren't as they should be. And I keep reading the headline, nothing will ever be the same again. My first question is really a fundamental one, and perhaps Suzanne would like to kick off with this one first, given your behavioural expertise. Will COVID actually change everything? Or will human memories prove short and we will all, like in previous crises, just revert to type?
I think that's a really interesting and complex question, because the thing about behaviour is all behaviour is learned, and once it's learned, it's actually done subconsciously. That's everything we do. And that subconscious response is done with a trigger. So something happens, you respond, and that's what behaviour is. So when we work with people who want behavioural change, the first thing is they need to want it. Often people change behaviour because something specific has happened. So if we take some very, very simple examples, somebody gets sick because of, say, being a smoker, and so they're really mindful of the impact that's had. So when they begin to recover from that illness, they are really mindful in the first instance of the triggers that have caused that illness. But as time goes on and they begin to feel better, they tend frequently to revert to previous behaviour. And that's because unless they do something to change the triggers and have some understanding of what it is in life that's kicking off that response, they can revert to type. So in something like this, what we will probably see is people will initially do what they should do, which is this new normal that we're all talking about, and behave differently. My worry is that we typically live in societies where people believe that they've got rights, you know, it's my right to have. People are quite self-centric typically. We've seen a change of that with communities and the way they're working together to support each other. But when all this is over, eventually, I think people will begin to revert to type, and I think that's terribly sad. And we need to do things within it, as Summ said, that changes what we do. And we need to be really active about that, because I don't think it's just going to happen. I think we've already seen for ourselves in our communities and in the news, people so-called flouting the guidelines. And if that's happening now when we're still in the relative danger zones, what's going to happen when we begin to get out of those danger zones? People will begin to do what they've always done. So when we create this new normal, we've got to create an environment that enables people to do things and support a new way of behaviour. And that in itself is a challenge.
So we need to provide a trigger. Who's going to be providing that trigger? Is it going to be city planners, architects, or someone else? Peter?
As I said earlier, I think it's going to be people themselves who will develop new ways of doing things. A lot of people have got used to working at home, and they realize that the problem of working at home is that you don't have a choice of anything else. People like to go to the office because it's very often the center of their social life. However, even before the pandemic, an awful lot of people were working from home, which is different from working at home. They would stay at home if they needed to write a report, which needed peace and quiet. They would go into the office for team meetings. They would be working as they traveled. So working was already becoming much more flexible, and office occupation rates had been dropping dramatically even before the pandemic. So I think those things are changing. The way people live in their communities. In many cities, there was a lack of community spirit because the communities are so transient. But we found that's changed quite dramatically in London as people have started thinking about their neighbours, starting thinking how they can help within a community. I don't think that's going to evaporate. And as I was describing in all the previous epidemics we've had over the years, they've all had some impact. If you want to see the changes that are coming, look at the really hard-headed people like the oil companies and the airlines. Look at the way they're desperately trying to adapt at the moment, not just for the next few months, but for the next decade.
So we've seen an increase in the value of society and people helping each other, which suggests that people want to be close to each other. And yet we've got this dichotomy between the density that implies and infection. And it's interesting that we've seen some densely populated cities cope relatively well with the COVID infection, like Singapore and Shanghai, others less so. So is it too simplistic to create this link between density and infection? Rob? You're on mute.
I think it is not too simplistic. I think density definitely is one of, if not the primary driver for infection. Obviously, the more people you have together in the closer proximity, the more you're going to have transmission. But I don't think it's the only factor. There's new research coming out. Again, this is a novel virus, so we have a lot of new research coming out. And all viruses mutate over time. And there's a study, I don't believe it's published yet, but will be published soon, that seems to indicate there's some strains of the virus that are potentially more infectious than others. And some of those strains migrate or move throughout the world in different patterns. For example, they currently believe, the study is proposing, that one of the original viruses that originated in China and then spread to the western part of the United States was potentially less infectious and less serious than a virus that mutated and spread through Europe and then to the eastern part of the United States in New York City, which is actually the current strain that is predominant over most of the world. So the differences we're seeing are somewhat related to population density, somewhat related to controls, but often related also to the virus itself and how the virus changes over time and which virus happens to hit which city at which time.
Thank you. So, Summ, as an architect, given we don't really know what the new normal is going to be, how do you think about this in your design process right now?
I think it's at the end of the day, it's still very good design that makes the difference. And I think I mentioned before how I'm always suspicious of clients who keep pushing the profit margin and you know, reduces the quantum of, say, social and community spaces within the development, or even squeezing the space standards and so forth. I think which is very obvious in Hong Kong sometimes, to see how everything is like a shoebox design in the end. And I think that is a big issue from a point of view of an architect, and also for the city and the government. I think one reason why I think Singapore is not feeling it as bad as permanent, because I think Singapore does govern and control space standards fairly well, and that 85% of Singaporeans actually live in public housing, and public housing in Singapore is of a very high quality and space standards, and as compared to private condominiums, for instance. So so I think, and there is, like, within almost 400 meters of where you live, you could actually go to a green space. So from that point of view, that's my point earlier, is that yes, we do need to move to a high density or even higher density, but at the same time, when you increase density, you must increase amenity at the equal rate. You don't cut it back where like it's in Hong Kong, you just go taller, but you have less amenities, which is not right. You need to be creative and innovative and create more spaces for the community use and social spaces. I have one very good example, is Skyville at Dawson in Singapore. It's a public housing, a demonstration public housing project I did in Singapore, where we created almost sky parks 4 times in a 50-story building, so that, you know, normally you would have a ground level in a 10-story social housing, public housing project. We replicated the ground level 4 times the sky parks within it. And we did a post-occupation survey, which is being lived in 5 years now. People that actually live in this compared to another building that hasn't got the same amount of amenities, they know 30 to 40% more friends than the person living in the other block. You know, there is a better sense of community, and there's a better sense of belonging as well in the development. And I think that through design and architecture, we can actually create a better environment for people.
Yeah, so I was just reading a question that's been sent in by James Parak, which you've partly answered from your perspective, which your answer being to raise the amenity above the ground plane as we traditionally see it. James has said that cities like Toronto and New York, where they're seeing traffic lanes being closed to provide more space for pedestrians to help with social distancing. And therefore, you know, how does the panel think the public space will change in a post-COVID world? Maybe that's part of it. I don't know if any of the others would like to elaborate on that from their perspectives.
I think the pedestrianisation is a really interesting and pertinent remark about cities, because if you took the transport out of cities, you reduce a lot of the negative impact of cities. So the air pollution, the CO2 emissions and so on. And you make it a safer place to live, but you also make it more people focused. So I think there are some real advantages to that. Whether or not it's logistically possible will be down to the planners and the designers, but I think it has an impact. It has an impact on our health as well, for sure.
Yeah. Rob, what about from your perspective in terms of transmission of disease that you eloquently spoke about?
Well, it's interesting. It depends on what direction it goes. If you take people out of public transportation, obviously that's a good thing. What we don't want to do from a disease perspective, put them all individually into cars, and they're going to be protected from disease, but that's not going to be sustainable, and it's going to create other issues with pollution. If we're going for more pedestrian urban areas, we need to be able to provide them the space to be able to move about. You know, maybe taking some of the lanes away from cars. I know a couple of cities have done that already and provided them to pedestrians and people on bicycles, which would be ideal. We don't want to cram our pedestrian walkways so close together that we're just taking people outside of the public transportation and putting them close together in the you know, areas where they walk and ride their bicycles. So it'll be interesting to see how it does evolve. I'm definitely thinking that we're going to see a lot less of your crowded trains and rail cars.
I think two terms that are actually quite interesting to debate and talk about is really about, we keep always talking about efficiency in systems and in cities. And I think with the current situation, I think maybe resilience may be a better term than what we always, you know, we're always trying to go for efficiency, but resilience in terms of maybe redundancy is also quite good too, because I think we have been always working with the minimum of things and areas, but really at the end of the day, we do need to build a little bit more and access so that we can actually cater to a bigger space standards for people. That's something I think it's something to rethink about when we come to talk about real estate as well.
It's obviously very important for us to reduce the density of people on public transport by providing more frequent public transport and more space for people to walk and cycle. And London had already made a lot of efforts in that regard. And if we stop spending so much money on stupid ego high-speed rail projects and use that money for improving the plumbing within our cities so that there is more space, that would be a great improvement. I was hearing the other day from the office manager of a very large consultancy firm in London, who said to me that they've recently noticed, or before the pandemic, that occupancy of the office was much, much lower on Mondays and Fridays because people are taking long weekends or going on holidays. And he's envisaging that it won't be particularly difficult to have a shift system where half of the office come in on each particular day. So you're again working from home and in the office. So that again can greatly reduce the strain on public transport and the density of people traveling.
Will that reduction in travel affect us culturally, Suzanne?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, we've begun to do it already, haven't we? Because we're not going anywhere. And people are already saying they're not sure they want to go back to the office. They're not sure they want to go back to an environment where people are traveling in and out from all sorts of places. And the people that run our offices are already saying, actually, agile working is going to look differently. We're not going to sit at every desk. We're going to have allocated desks that are cleaned regularly, and you sit every other desk, and we won't have any breakout spaces. That actually is a challenge in itself, because why would people want to go to the office where there was no communion with their colleagues? That doesn't make any sense. Why are you there? You may as well be back at home. So I think it's a huge challenge culturally, but I think we can do it. But I think we need to put in place really good things. In the human behavioural side, people need to understand, or typically what they do is they need to understand, what do I get out of it? And that is their kind of go-to position. And that's not a selfish thing, that's just human nature. What do I get out of it? And then what can I contribute to it? And how do I contribute to it? So when we set all this up, we've got to really understand human nature and look at, when we set these offices up and make these changes, how do we do it so that everybody benefits? That's the question we need to answer. So you don't want to say, come to the office, but don't have coffee, don't talk to your friends, you know, don't have meetings. You want to say, we'll do this, but we'll do it in a different way. And this is how we're going to do it.
Maybe
New processes.
Yes, thank you. Maybe the other thing we need to think about is not just our work environments, but our home environments. And one of the, I mean, there is a school of thought that this whole crisis will accelerate certain trends which were already in place beforehand. And one common theme across the world seems to be a housing crisis of some sort. Peter, a question is coming for you on that, which says, has the time come to nationalise housing and push for rental housing with rent controls?
Yes and no. Certainly not nationalise housing, because public bodies and governments are probably the worst people to control housing. I think history has proved that. But we do need to move away from the gold standard of home ownership in urban areas towards rented property. I think with more mobile societies, the idea of putting all of your assets into home ownership, even if you can afford to in an urban area, is badly flawed and has created a huge investment residential market, which has driven the cost of residential accommodation in cities like London out of the reach of the people who need it. So we do need large-scale housing rental. That needs two things. First of all, the industry to provide and manage rented property. They're very happy to do that and will do it if it's the most profitable thing they're allowed to do. So we'll have to stop them building investment resi blocks like the one I'm in at the moment, which are largely empty because they're only safety deposit boxes, and actually purpose them towards making this housing that people really need. And the other thing, as the questioner said, is we do need government control in terms of two things: rent control, but even more importantly, security of tenure. If you know that as long as you pay your rent and don't trash your apartment, you cannot be thrown out, then it will feel like a home. At the moment, too many rental properties are owned by somebody who has one or two properties who might just throw you out because they want to liquidate their assets at a particular point in time. So rented property needs to be a totally different land use from homes that are for ownership. And then they can be managed in these ways that have been suggested, but not by the state, I would suggest.
Summ, given that Singapore's probably top of the class in the world in terms of social housing, is there anything that we can learn from?
I don't think Singapore is the top of the class. I think Austria is. Austria has a longer history of social housing, and they're really very successful at it. But Singapore is pretty good. And but I think maybe it's I do share Peter Rees' point, but in Singapore and maybe in Asia, there is some cultural differences, and rental apartments are not that favored, and people see landed properties as a very sound investment asset. And I think like times like this, you do realize that all our financial products and money in our banks has been investments have like been halved completely, but you know your property stays put basically because it takes a longer time for prices to go up and down. So, and I think there is it's something that has been debated a long time in Singapore and also in Asia, but there is a tendency for Asians to still think of property as assets, as savings, rather than investment.
That's true, and they're damaging London and New York as a consequence.
Yeah, it is true. I don't deny that. And I think it's the wealthy Asians buying up safe deposit boxes. I couldn't agree with you more, but that's because they see it as a asset, as a safety deposit box. And that's what they see it, that their wealth will be kept there. And that's why it's going to happen more and more in cities like London, New York, Paris, and Singapore. The wealthy will continue to buy apartments. You just can't stop that.
Well, unless the wealthy lose a lot of their wealth. And of course,
yes.
Russian oligarchs now have worthless oil.
Yeah, but I think the housing that needs to be addressed really is the lower category and the middle category, which is the most depressing one, and not to allow the wealthier people to actually buy this category of housing. That's the way to control it.
Getting back to the issue of pandemics, a question, Rob, perhaps you could try to answer is that, and maybe one thing I've been thinking about, Summ's point about the need to build in redundancy in designs, whether that's designs of public spaces or buildings, because we just don't know what the future holds. Is part of the new normal that there could be a COVID-20 or COVID-21? We're just going to have these pandemics which appear in the future at more regular intervals, which means that we all need to be more flexible in our approach?
Yeah, I guess the question often, you know, what are we going to do in the future? We don't know. Like you said, is it going to be 2-3 years from now that we're going to see another virus? Is it going to be 100 years from now? Nobody knows. It depends on our memory that we
I think
spoke
it's going
about
to be
earlier.
sooner than we think.
It's going to depend on our risk tolerance too. It's really interesting.
Robert, is it true? I was just reading today that there's another 1.7 million of viruses that's likely to actually hop over from animals to people.
Oh, absolutely. We're always at risk of this. We never
Waiting to hop over.
You know, and when we talk about risk and when we design for the future, a lot of it depends on our risk tolerance. And I think a lot of the conversation has developed around that. I mean, 6 months ago, going to an office and having the risk of coming down with a disease that is, you know, 0.5% mortality rate would be unheard of. But now we're opening things back up, and that risk is acceptable somehow. So it'll be interesting on what our memory is of this. It'll be interesting what our risk tolerance develops into, how well we value human life. Quite frankly.
Rob, don't you think this will depend very much on how the current pandemic kicks back? I mean, I can easily see this pandemic going on for 2 or 3 years somewhere in the world. And if we get repeated waves of this, don't you think that'll change people's thinking in a way that they don't when they think this is a one-off phenomenon?
No, I think you're right. I think this is more likely than not from what we know is there are going to be waves. There's going to be areas of the world that it's going to last longer due to access. If we do develop a treatment, if we do develop a vaccine, that's going to be accessible for people that can afford it and societies that can invest in that. But within 2 or 3 years, it's going to be in the rearview mirror, and there may be another one. But I think science will get us there, or at least what they call herd immunity will get us there. And then the question is, you know, anything I was alluded to earlier, if you get punched in the face, how long does it take you to stop your behavior so you don't get punched again? You know, what's our societal memory, right?
But what's interesting, Rob, is in the last decade, we've seen probably more of these major things than in the last century. So we've had Zika, we've had Ebola, we've had SARS, we've now got this. And actually in that last decade, that is quite an exponential change from what we've experienced previously. And is that the state of things to come? I mean, I guess we don't have a crystal ball, we can't predict it. But I think it's a wake-up call to us as humanity.
I think it is too. I 100% agree with you. Question is, humanity is a large population. It's more than just us on the call. And you know,
yeah.
you factor in greed and you factor in other aspects that, you know, and personal entitlement, as you alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
It's more of a sociology question, I think. We're going to see more of this. We're going to hear more about it too, because our worlds, we're so much tighter together with having a conference right now, like this, we're sharing information. Mm-hmm. So when you do have diseases in the last 10, 15, 20 years, you have Ebola where, you know, when I was studying it back in college, Ebola was still going, you know, there were Ebola outbreaks, you didn't hear about them as much. But now, since we have the 24/7 news cycle, when Ebola comes out, we do hear about it. Mm-hmm. So not only is there more of it, we're hearing more about it, and hopefully that will result in us making some changes to prevent it and save lives.
Thank you. We're an hour in, but I've been given permission to extend by 5 or 10 minutes if we're still into a discussion, which it feels like we are. But here's a question from someone which maybe takes us down the home straight, which is really the fundamental one about, given everything we've said about the challenges of living in cities, is our urban habitat actually under threat? Do people still want to live and work in cities? Peter.
Well, I can remember when I was 6 or 7 years of age, living in a small city in the west of Great Britain, seeing a train go past with lamps on each of the tables in the carriages. It looked very smart, and I wanted to know where that train went. It went to London. I came to London. I don't want to go back.
Summ?
I think it's not a choice. The reality is that by 2050, 70% of people will be moving to cities because there is no other alternative. Certainly for Singapore, we have no other alternative. We are almost a land-limited city. And I think from my point of view too is we cannot continue to exploit our planet without thinking about consequences. We do need to think through how we actually live in dense situation, but we can design cities better, like Peter say. And I think there's a lot of rethinking how to plan and do better cities. And I think there is this sort of a rampant urbanization in Asia. And I think we have too many bad cities. And I think it's time to actually rethink how to actually make all the cities better.
Suzanne, do people still want to go to cities?
Yeah, I think they do. And I echo what the previous two speakers have said, actually. Although I'm the opposite to Peter. I was born and bred in London. And then I, having lived there most of my life, wanted to get out into the countryside, but that's a completely different aspect. But I think that, yes, people will still want cities. And I think it's about how we make those places healthy and sustainable.
Yeah.
Do we think the mix of uses will change in cities? Given this might change the way we work and the density of workspaces, and perhaps we'll spend more time at home and going between home and work.
Well, I think we know that retail isn't coming back anytime soon. One thing that has been accelerated tremendously by the lockdown is people buying things online rather than going into shops to buy them.
Yeah.
Equally, I mean, within less than 10 minutes of walk of where I am at the moment, there are, I think, between 12 and 15 branches of the same takeaway, pret-a-manger. Now, they're not all going to reopen. And I think that's probably a good thing because certain areas of the economy have grown in a way that isn't functional or isn't actually good for our places. But what we've got to do is to find a way of retaining our high streets, our main shopping streets, as the centers of our urban communities. And the way to do that is to move in the startup businesses, education, social facilities, all the things that people actually need in the society, and put those where the shops used to be. That may mean an intervention by the local authorities to buy up the empty shop units. There are already lots throughout this country. It's going to be much worse after the pandemic, but that's a great opportunity for creating new urban hubs.
But our cities aren't just about places to work and live, are they? Many of our great cities in the world have got huge tourist attraction. They've got places you absolutely want to go and see. For anyone with a traveling bug, they want to get out to some of those great places. So is that going to change? Well, there'll still be great places with amazing architecture and incredible things to go and visit. So we need to make them safe so that we can do all of those things.
Peter, if you were back in your role as Chief Planning Officer now in London or anywhere else, what would you want the planners to do to help in all of this? We've seen in London at the moment that the rapid rise of sustainability up the agenda, and very soon any referred schemes in London are going to need to assess their buildings for whole life carbon. Do you see the same thing happening across wider issues related to the pandemic challenges?
Well, first, I think we need central government, not just in this country, but particularly in Britain, to re-empower planning, because there hasn't been much belief in planning. There's been more belief in development over the last couple of decades. And I think if the politicians step back, I mean, politicians are amateurs. They don't know what they're doing, and they're the ones that usually make the mistakes. So if we can reconnect the professionals with the community and allow the professionals to listen to the community and find out what they want and help them to start it with pop-up initiatives. I call it grassroots planning or join the dots planning. Top-down strategies come from politicians. They're all about the ego of the politician. You know, whether it happens to be the president of a major world country or a local councillor, it's all about their egos, the sort of projects they can open and claim credit for. What we really need to do is to work with people to make their places better with them.
Yes. Maybe to finish, one subject we haven't really talked about is technology. And I actually read a rather interesting article in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago, which was suggesting that technology will save us. There are some very good reasons to be cheerful, from the application of AI in identifying new drugs to safe testing of driverless cars, which, by the way, are going to be powered by human urine. So maybe, Rob, maybe I'll start with you on this one. What can cities, real estate learn from science? And maybe one for a related question to the others is, to what extent will we see the design of buildings and cities in the future being more of a collaboration between real estate professionals, designers and others, and maybe those from a scientific background, whether they're healthcare experts, biologists or whomever? Rob, if you could kick us off.
Sure. I mean, I can speak to the infection control standpoint. I'm not an architect or an engineer, but the advances in science and the development of there's advancements in potentially developing vaccines that can be made synthetically, which would, if that is the case, be produced a lot cheaper and a lot faster. Within buildings, there's a lot of new technologies that are being explored. We've always advanced our buildings through technology. In controlling disease, there's potentially UVC lighting that they're investigating is, can this lighting kill bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms, but not affect the human body and skin and eyes? Right now, the problem with UV is, it kills the virus, but also potentially causes skin cancer and eye damage. Is there a wavelength out there that could potentially, kill an airborne virus? That's being explored right now. I think right now, with the economic toll of this virus, it's going to result in a lot more investment in technology to prevent this from occurring again, which is a positive thing. Be interesting to see where we are in 2 years. Yeah.
What about the Summ, in terms of the creation of new buildings? To what extent will we embrace more experts in that process?
I think it's happening already. I mean, Kampong Amity was a great example. It was a elderly facility. At the same time, it was also had a medical center and a lot of public amenities to it. And I think it was because it was a integrated development that had 7 government departments and 4 ministries coming together. So the winning formula was how to actually negotiate between all the parties. But one thing was very, very clear of that project. It was about putting the elderly back into where it matters, and also about active, healthy living. So it was it was a larger project than what it was just as building, but we actually look at the entire area of the whole housing development and to see where we should put it and how to actually make the elderly people, even within the building and within the estate, move, in a safe manner, and to actually move around and connect back to the cities. And that was through a lot of discussion with medical consultants and stakeholders, and even the medical center that we did, where the waiting areas are actually thought of as the living room for all the people who actually live here. And during the times of haze in Singapore, which does happen occasionally once a year, it's where the elderly would actually come and use those air-conditioned spaces, which they won't have in their own apartments, which is just naturally ventilated design apartments. So I think, and I think it's a lot of collaboration needs to happen, definitely. And I think it is happening, and I think it should happen a lot more.
Suzanne, from your perspective, can you see yourself being involved in that design process?
Yeah, absolutely. As clinical planners, that's what we do, but we look specifically at the healthcare element of it. So we would be involved hugely in the design of hospitals based around excellence in clinical delivery and the development of clinical models. Already over the last decade, we've looked at the fact we as a population are aging. And that means we need to deliver healthcare in a very different way, because demand is absolutely outstripping capacity for sure. So we're looking at different models. And that means we're looking at things like community living, smart cities, healthy cities, as Munsum alluded to. And that's a very different type of design, but it needs to be underpinned with an understanding of what health looks like, about how we try to empower people to look after their own health. Because certainly a lot of what goes on in the UK is the worried well. They overpower our healthcare systems with little niggles and concerns, which means the people with genuine issues don't necessarily get seen. The elderly have the complex comorbidities that mean they need a different kind of involvement, but actually the safest place for them is to keep them well in their own community, not drag them into homes. And what this pandemic has shown us is that perhaps we need to be designing our healthcare campuses in a very different way. Perhaps we need hospitals for the sick, and then outpatient places somewhere else for those that actually aren't sick but have something they need fixing. They're medically well, but they need something fixing. So it's a huge challenge, and absolutely we need to collaborate, not just with designers and planners and politicians and policymakers, but with healthcare specialists and clinical planners. Absolutely. I think it needs to be a collaborative way forward. And I guess what this pandemic has shown us is that we can collaborate and work as communities. And now we need to take it one step forward into whatever it is this new normal will be.
The worried well. I've got a new phrase for my armory. Thank you.
Worried well.
I'm going to leave the last word to you before we wrap up. Any final thoughts or comments on technology or anything else related to the subject?
Sorry, was that directed at me?
Yes, Peter, yeah.
All right. Yes, Steve. I agree with all that's been said, that we need to learn from each other. We need to collaborate as professionals. We need to collaborate as communities, as different nations around the world, observe what's worked and what hasn't worked. And rather than use that to point fingers and blame, use it to learn and to actually do things better. I am deeply suspicious when people say there's a technological solution to things, when there should really be a social solution to most of these problems. When you look at the geeks who invent artificial intelligence and look at their lifestyles, you begin to wonder whether it's the sort of intelligence you want. Rather than self-driving cars, I'd like to see no driving cars, just like the one I showed earlier.
I think a very provocative and thought-provoking end to the session. I'd like to thank every one of you, Peter, Munsum, Rob and Suzanne, very much for your contribution. Thank you everyone for listening, and I think we had over 60 questions and comments. In the end, we couldn't accommodate everyone. I apologize. I think it'd be very good to speak again on this very subject in a year's time to see what has changed and how we have developed and hopefully taken on some of the positive aspects that we've spoken about. And finally, just a reminder, as Steve said at the beginning, that our next event is on the 10th of June on the subject of smart technology. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.